Welcome to Criminal Nights. Tonight, I'll take you into the shadows of true crime, where the most vulnerable among us become prey in places meant to protect them. I'm your guide through these dark corridors, where trust is shattered and innocence is stolen. Before we dive into tonight's haunting tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching Criminal Nights from. Your voice in our community helps us know we're not alone in seeking truth in the darkness. Tonight, we venture into a realm where evil wears scrubs and carries medication trays, where those who should heal become harbingers of death. We're entering the sterile halls of nursing homes, where behind locked doors and behind kind smiles, some of the most chilling crimes in history have unfolded. I can still smell the antiseptic mixed with something else, something wrong when I think about the case that first opened my eyes to this hidden world of elder abuse and murder. It was 3 years ago when I first walked through the automatic glass doors of Shady Pines Nursing Home in Indiana, following a lead that would haunt my dreams for months to come. The facility looked innocent enough from the outside: red brick walls, well-maintained gardens, a sign promising compassionate care for your loved ones. But as I would soon discover, some promises are made only to be broken in the most horrific ways imaginable. It started with Margaret Whitmore, an 87-year-old woman with dementia who had been a resident at Shady Pines for 2 years. Margaret had been a schoolteacher for 40 years before retiring, known in her community for her gentle nature and infectious laugh. Her daughter Sarah visited every Tuesday and Thursday religiously, bringing homemade cookies and reading her mother stories from the local newspaper. On a cold February morning, Sarah arrived for her usual visit to find her mother's room empty. When she asked the staff where Margaret was, they told her with practiced sympathy that her mother had passed peacefully in her sleep during the night. Heart failure, they said. Common for someone her age, they assured her. But Sarah knew her mother. She knew Margaret had been in good spirits just 2 days before, asking when her granddaughter would visit for her birthday. Something felt wrong, terribly, sickeningly wrong. I was contacted by Sarah 3 weeks after Margaret's death. She had been calling the facility daily, demanding answers that never came, receiving only patronizing explanations about the natural process of aging. When the funeral director mentioned that Margaret's body had shown signs of unusual muscle rigidity, and her lips had a strange blue tint that didn't match typical heart failure, Sarah's suspicions crystallized into horror. Walking through Shady Pines for the first time, I noticed how the staff moved with practiced efficiency, their smiles bright but their eyes cold. The head nurse, Patricia Kellerman, was a woman in her mid-50s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and hands that seemed to never stop moving, adjusting charts, straightening papers, always busy, always in control. Mrs. Whitmore was well loved here, Patricia told me as we sat in her office, the walls decorated with certificates of excellence and photos of smiling elderly residents. Her passing was peaceful. Sometimes families have trouble accepting the natural order of things, but natural was the last word I would use to describe what I discovered next. Through careful investigation and conversations with other families, a pattern began to emerge. In the past 18 months, 17 residents had died at Shady Pine, officially from natural causes, all occurring during the night shift when fewer staff members were present. The mortality rate was nearly double that of comparable facilities in the area. The night shift was supervised by Patricia Kellerman herself, who had volunteered for the less desirable hours, claiming she wanted to ensure the residents received the best care when they were most vulnerable. She was often the only registered nurse on duty, giving her access to all residents and their medications. I spent weeks interviewing families, former employees, and medical professionals. What I uncovered was a web of systematic murder disguised as compassionate care. Patricia had been using insulin injections to induce hypoglycemic shock in diabetic patients, while administering overdoses of heart medication to those with cardiac conditions. 2 residents, without pre-existing conditions, that would explain sudden death. She used succinylcholine, paralytic agent that stops breathing, but leaves no trace in standard autopsies. The most chilling aspect was her method of selection. Patricia chose victims based on their visitor patterns and family involvement. Margaret Whitmore, despite Sarah's devotion, was targeted because Patricia had learned that Sarah would be traveling out of state for a week to care for her own daughter, who had just given birth. Patricia waited for that window when she knew no one would be coming to check on Margaret for several days. During my investigation, I spoke with Robert Chen, a former night shift aide who had quit abruptly 6 months before Margaret's death. Robert was haunted by what he had witnessed, but had been too frightened to speak up. He described how Patricia would make special rounds during the early morning hours, carrying a small black medical bag that was never part of standard nursing supplies. I saw her enter rooms of residents who were sleeping peacefully, Robert told me, his voice barely above a whisper, as we sat in a coffee shop miles away from Shady Pines. They would go to sleep normal, and by morning, they were gone. She always had an explanation: heart attack, stroke, natural causes, but I started noticing a pattern. The residents she visited during those special rounds were always the ones with limited family contact, or those whose families were temporarily unable to visit. Robert described one particular night when he accidentally witnessed Patricia entering the room of Harold Summers, a 91-year-old man whose only son lived across the country and visited just twice a year. Harold was lucid, mobile, and in relatively good health for his age. I was restocking supplies in the hall when I saw her slip into Harold's room around 3 a.m. Robert continued, his hands shaking as he gripped his coffee cup. Harold was asleep, breathing normally. She stood over his bed for a long moment, then pulled something from her bag. I couldn't see exactly what, but her movements were deliberate, practiced. When she left his room 20 minutes later, I checked on him. Harold was still breathing, but something felt different. His breathing was shallow, labored. By morning, he was dead. The medical examiner had ruled Harold's death as cardiac arrest, citing his advanced age and the facility's records indicating a history of heart problems that Harold's medical records from his previous physician showed no evidence of. Patricia had been falsifying medical histories to support her murder methods. As I dug deeper into Patricia's background, I discovered a woman whose life had been shaped by a twisted sense of control and a pathological need to play God. She had worked in nursing homes for over 20 years, leaving each facility after suspicious clusters of deaths that somehow never triggered thorough investigations. She was skilled at choosing facilities with lax oversight and overwhelmed management places, where her expertise and willingness to work difficult shifts made her indispensable. Patricia's psychological profile revealed a person who derived satisfaction from the power over life and death, but who also convinced herself she was performing acts of mercy. In interrogation tapes I later obtained, she spoke about ending suffering and providing peaceful transitions, language that revealed how she had rationalized mass murder as compassionate care. The investigation revealed that Patricia had a specific ritual for her murders. She would spend weeks observing potential victims, learning their routines, their family visits, their medical needs. She kept detailed notes in a personal journal disguised as nursing observations. When she selected a victim, she would often spend extra time with them in the days leading up to their murder, bringing them special treats or staying to chat after administering medications. To outside observers, she appeared to be an especially caring nurse, forming bonds with residents. But this apparent kindness served a darker purpose. Patricia was savoring the power she held over these vulnerable people, knowing that she had already decided their fate while they trusted her completely. She would later describe feeling a rush of excitement during these final interactions, knowing she possessed the ultimate secret while her victims remained blissfully unaware. The breakthrough in the case came when Patricia made a crucial mistake. She had targeted Eleanor Martinez, an 85-year-old woman with early-stage Alzheimer's whose family visited infrequently due to geographical distance. Patricia had learned that Eleanor's daughter was going through a difficult divorce and wouldn't be able to visit for at least a month. What Patricia didn't know was that Eleanor had developed a friendship with her roommate, Agnes Murphy, a 89-year-old, who had been at Shady Pines for just 3 months. Agnes had noticed the pattern of deaths and had been quietly documenting strange occurrences in a small notebook she kept hidden in her bedside drawer. On the night Patricia entered Eleanor's bed area, Agnes pretended to be asleep but was watching through barely opened eyes. She saw Patricia inject something into Eleanor's foreline and witnessed Eleanor's subsequent distress, the confusion, the difficulty breathing, the way her body seemed to fight against an invisible force. Agnes managed to alert a night aide who found Eleanor in severe distress. Eleanor was rushed to the hospital, where blood tests revealed dangerous levels of insulin despite not being diabetic. Eleanor survived, though she suffered permanent neurological damage from the hypoglycemic episode. Agnes's testimony and the medical evidence finally provided the foundation needed to investigate Patricia Kellerman thoroughly. When police searched Patricia's home, they found her journals detailing each murder, complete with victim selection criteria, method notes, and disturbing personal reflections on her work. One journal entry, dated just days before Margaret Whitmore's murder, read, "Margaret shows signs of increasing confusion, but maintains strong family bonds. Daughter visits regularly, but has mentioned upcoming travel. Window of opportunity approaching. Subject responds well to evening medications and trusts nursing staff implicitly. Natural progression would be cardiac event during sleep cycle." The clinical language Patricia used to describe murder revealed the depth of her psychological detachment from the humanity of her victims. She saw them not as people with families and histories and dreams, but as subjects in her twisted experiment with death. During the trial, the full scope of Patricia's crimes came to light. Forensic investigators exhumed bodies from her previous employment locations and found evidence of similar murders dating back over a decade. The final victim count reached 43 elderly residents across 5 different nursing homes in 3 states. If this story chills you so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another night of true crime. The darkness we're exploring together reveals truths that society often prefers to keep hidden. But your courage to face these realities helps protect the vulnerable among us. Patricia's trial revealed the systematic nature of her crimes and the way she had exploited the trust placed in healthcare workers. Expert witnesses testified about the particular vulnerability of elderly residents in nursing homes isolated from family, dependent on staff for basic needs, and often suffering from conditions that make them unreliable witnesses to their own abuse. The prosecution presented evidence of Patricia's careful planning and her manipulation of medical records to cover her tracks. She had created false medical histories for her victims, forged physician orders for medications that would support her cover stories, and had even gone so far as to comfort grieving families while knowing she was responsible for their loss. The psychological evaluation revealed that Patricia suffered from what experts termed medical serial killer syndrome, a rare but documented condition where healthcare workers use their access and authority to commit murder. These killers are often motivated by a combination of power fantasies, a God complex, and sometimes a twisted sense of mercy or compassion. What made Patricia particularly dangerous was her intelligence and her understanding of the system. She knew which facilities had weak oversight, which types of deaths would go unquestioned, and how to manipulate the emotions and trust of families dealing with the stress of eldercare decisions. The families of her victims faced a unique type of trauma. Not only had they lost their loved ones, but they had to grapple with the knowledge that someone they had trusted with their most vulnerable family members had betrayed that trust in the most horrific way possible. Many spoke about feeling guilty for not recognizing the signs, for being grateful to Patricia for her apparent kindness, for trusting the system that had failed their loved ones so completely. Sarah Whitmore, Margaret's daughter, testified about the particular cruelty of Patricia's deception. "She comforted me when my mother died," Sarah said through tears during her victim impact statement. "She told me how peaceful she looked, how she wasn't suffering, all while knowing she had murdered her. The grief was terrible, but learning the truth has been worse. I'll never be able to trust anyone with caring for someone I love again." The defense attempted to argue that Patricia was providing mercy killings for residents who were suffering, but the evidence clearly showed that she targeted victims based on opportunity and vulnerability, not medical condition. Many of her victims were in good health for their age and could have lived months or years longer. Agnes Murphy, the roommate who witnessed Eleanor Martinez's near murder, became a hero in the case, but she struggled with survivor's guilt. In an interview months after the trial, Agnes told me, "I keep thinking about all the nights I was sleeping while she was killing people in the next bed, down the hall. How many could I have saved if I had been more alert, more suspicious?" Agnes's words haunt me still. They speak to the vulnerability we all face as we age, the trust we must place in systems and people who may not deserve it, and the thin line between safety and danger in places we assume are sanctuaries. The Shady Pines case led to significant changes in nursing home oversight and monitoring systems. New protocols for tracking resident deaths, mandatory reporting of unusual mortality patterns, and enhanced background check systems were implemented across the state. But as I would learn in subsequent investigations, these changes, while important, cannot address the fundamental human element of evil that finds its way into systems meant to protect the vulnerable. Patricia Kellerman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During her sentencing, she showed no remorse and maintained that she had been providing a service to residents who were ready to go. The judge, in pronouncing the sentence, called her crimes a profound betrayal of the sacred trust placed in healthcare providers and a violation of the fundamental human right to dignity in one's final years. But Patricia's story was just the beginning of what I would discover about crimes in nursing homes. The institutional nature of these facilities, the vulnerability of the residents, and the power dynamics between staff and patients create perfect conditions for abuse, neglect, and murder. What happened at Shady Pines was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, darker pattern that spans across the country and affects thousands of elderly residents every year. The most disturbing aspect of these crimes is how they exploit our most basic assumptions about care and compassion. We entrust nursing homes with our most vulnerable family members, believing that the people who work there are motivated by a desire to help and comfort. The reality, as I've discovered through years of investigating these cases, is far more complex and often far more sinister. As I walked out of Shady Pines for the last time after Patricia's arrest, I couldn't shake the feeling that behind the cheerful decorations and posted visiting hours, other secrets were waiting to be discovered. The antiseptic smell that had bothered me on my first visit now seemed to carry the weight of all the lives lost, all the trust betrayed, all the families who would never know the full truth of their loved ones' final moments. The case of Patricia Kellerman in Shady Pines opened a door for me into a world I never wanted to explore but couldn't turn away from. It was the first of many investigations that would reveal the darkness hiding in plain sight in facilities across the country, places where those who should be safest are often in the greatest danger, and where evil wears the mask of mercy. Margaret Whitmore's death was not just a tragedy, was a warning, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the night shift hours when no one is watching, carried by those we trust most, to protect the people we love most. And sometimes, The most dangerous place for our loved ones is the place we believe will keep them safest. The fluorescent lights in nursing home. Corridors have a particular quality. They buzz with an electrical hum that becomes the soundtrack to tragedy. I learned this during my investigation into what the media would later call the Angel of Death case at Sunset Manor in Ohio, where the line between mercy and murder became so blurred that even seasoned detectives questioned their own judgment about right and wrong. It was 6 months after the Patricia Kellerman case when I received a call from Detective Maria Santos of the Cleveland Police Department. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much, but this case was different. Tit was breaking her down in ways that 20 years of homicide investigations hadn't. "We have a situation," she told me over the phone, the words careful and measured. 17 deaths in 3 months at a nursing home. All natural causes, according to the death certificates. But the families, ... They're saying things that don't add up. And there's this nurse. The residents love her. The families praise her. She's being nominated for a state nursing award, but I can't shake the feeling that something is very, very wrong. That nurse was Rebecca Torres, a 34-year-old registered nurse who had been working at Sunset Manor for just over a year. By all external measures, Rebecca was the ideal healthcare worker, compassionate, dedicated, often staying past her shifts to comfort distressed residents. She had a gentle voice, kind eyes, and a way of making even the most confused dementia patients feel calm and secure. But as I would discover, Rebecca Torres was orchestrating one of the most psychologically complex murder sprees in nursing home history, driven not by sadistic pleasure like Patricia Kellerman, but by a twisted maternal instinct that had transformed compassion into its most dangerous opposite. Sunset Manor sat on a tree-lined street in a quiet residential neighborhood, its brick facade and well-maintained grounds giving it the appearance of a comfortable retirement community rather than a medical facility. The interior was decorated with warm colors and family photos, designed to feel more like a home than an institution. It was exactly the kind of place families chose when they wanted their elderly relatives to feel loved and cared for, rather than simply warehoused. Rebecca had specifically requested to work in the memory care unit, where residents with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia required the most intensive supervision and care. She told her supervisor she felt called to work with this population because they needed advocates, people who would ensure their dignity was preserved even as their minds deteriorated. The first death that caught Detective Santos's attention was that of William Morrison, a 78-year-old former mechanic who had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's 2 years earlier. William's daughter, Linda, had chosen Sunset Manor specifically because of its reputation for memory care, and she had been impressed by how quickly William seemed to settle into the routine. He actually seemed happier there than he had been at home, Linda told me during our interview. The staff was wonderful, especially Rebecca. She treated him like he was her own father. She would sit with him during meals when he got confused about how to use his utensils. She would play his favorite music when he got agitated. He called her his angel. William's decline was gradual but steady over his 8 months at Sunset Manor. Rebecca documented his deterioration carefully, noting increased confusion, difficulty with basic tasks, and periods of distress that she managed with what appeared to be extraordinary patience and skill. The family was grateful for her updates and her obvious devotion to their father's care. William died on a Thursday morning in early September. Rebecca had worked a double shift the night before, staying to cover for a colleague who had called in sick. She was the one who found William unresponsive in his bed during her morning rounds. According to her report, he appeared peaceful, and given his advancing dementia and recent decline in appetite, his death was not unexpected. But Linda Morrison had questions that wouldn't go away. Her father had been in good spirits during her visit just 3 days earlier. He had recognized her, asked about her children, and had eaten a full dinner. The sudden decline Rebecca described didn't match what Linda had observed, and the timing dying just after Rebecca had worked an unscheduled overnight shift felt suspicious. What Linda didn't know was that Rebecca had been documenting a false narrative of William's decline. In reality, William had been stable, even showing some improvement in his cognitive function, but Rebecca had been slowly poisoning him with overdoses of his prescribed sleep medication, administered through his evening medications over the course of several weeks. The poisoning was carefully calculated to mimic the natural progression of dementia-related decline. Rebecca would increase the dosage gradually, causing increased confusion and fatigue that appeared to be disease progression. She would then document these symptoms as natural deterioration, building a medical record that would support the eventual death as an expected outcome. Rebecca's method was particularly insidious because it exploited the expectations around dementia care. Families of Alzheimer's patients are prepared for decline and death. They're told to expect confusion, loss of appetite, and eventual organ failure. Rebecca was using this knowledge to mask murder as natural disease progression. The second death that raised Detective Santos's suspicions was Martha Chen, an 82-year-old woman with moderate dementia who had been at Sunset Manor for 6 months. Martha was known for her artistic abilities even with her cognitive impairment. She could still create beautiful watercolor paintings during the facility's art therapy sessions. Martha's son, David, visited every Sunday and had developed a routine of bringing new art supplies and displaying her latest creations in her room. During his final visit, Martha seemed particularly excited about a landscape she was working on, and she clearly recognized David and asked about his wife and children. 3 days later, Rebecca called to inform David that his mother had died peacefully in her sleep. The death certificate listed complications from dementia as the cause, noting a rapid decline in cognitive function and loss of appetite in the weeks prior to death. But David remembered his mother's enthusiasm just days before, and when he went to collect her belongings, he noticed that the landscape painting she had been excited to show him was missing. When he asked Rebecca about it, she explained that Martha had become upset with the painting and had destroyed it during a moment of confusion. This explanation didn't fit with David's knowledge of his mother's gentle nature. Even in her confused states, Martha had never been violent or destructive, and her artwork had always brought her joy rather than distress. The missing painting became a symbol of all the questions David couldn't answer about his mother's final days. As I investigated Martha's death, I discovered that Rebecca had been stealing small personal items from residents who died under her care, not valuable things, but sentimental objects that had meaning to the families. The missing painting was part of a collection Rebecca kept in her apartment, a gallery of trophies from her victims. The psychological evaluation of Rebecca that would later be conducted revealed that she collected these items as a way of maintaining a connection to the residents she killed. In her distorted thinking, she believed she was preserving their memory and honoring their lives by keeping something that represented their personality or interests. But the investigation also revealed something more disturbing about Rebecca's motivation. Unlike Patricia Kellerman, who killed for power and control, Rebecca was driven by what she perceived as love and protection. She had convinced herself that she was saving her victims from the indignity and suffering of advanced dementia by providing them with a peaceful death while they still retained some sense of themselves. Rebecca had lost her own grandmother to Alzheimer's when she was in nursing school, and she had been traumatized by witnessing the elderly woman's deterioration over several years. Her grandmother had eventually become completely nonverbal, unable to recognize family members, and required total care for basic functions. Rebecca had promised herself she would never let anyone suffer that way if she could prevent it. This promise had transformed into a mission that she carried out with methodical precision at Sunset Manor. Rebecca identified residents in the early to moderate stages of dementia who still had moments of clarity and connection with their families. She would then monitor their condition carefully, and when she determined they were approaching the point where their quality of life would significantly decline, she would intervene. Her method was sophisticated and difficult to detect. She would gradually increase dosages of legitimate medications, particularly sedatives and sleep aids that were commonly prescribed for dementia patients who experienced sundowning or sleep disturbances. The overdoses would be administered over weeks or sometimes months, creating a slow decline that appeared to be disease progression. Rebecca kept detailed personal notes about each resident she targeted, documenting not just their medical condition, but their relationships, their interests, their moments of joy and clarity. She wrote about their personalities, their fears about their declining condition, and what she interpreted as their wishes for a peaceful end. One particularly chilling entry from Rebecca's private journal, discovered during the investigation, described her decision-making process regarding Thomas Wright, an 85-year-old retired teacher with mild dementia. Thomas had a moment today where he couldn't remember his wife's name. He became so upset, crying and apologizing. He kept saying he didn't want to forget her, that forgetting her would be like losing her all over again. His daughter visits every few days, and I can see the pain in her eyes when he doesn't recognize her immediately. Thomas is still Thomas most of the time, but those moments are getting shorter. He deserves to leave while he's still himself, while his last conscious thoughts can be of love rather than confusion. Thomas Wright died 2 weeks after that journal entry, officially from complications related to his dementia. Rebecca had administered fatal overdoses of his sleep medication over the course of 10 days, timing his death to occur on a night when his daughter wasn't scheduled to visit until the weekend. The investigation revealed that Rebecca had murdered at least 23 residents over the course of 14 months at Sunset Manor. Her victim selection process was based on her assessment of their quality of life and her prediction of their future decline, combined with careful observation of family visiting patterns to minimize the likelihood of unexpected discoveries. What made Rebecca's crimes particularly disturbing was the genuine grief she showed when her victims died. She would comfort families, help with funeral arrangements, and attend memorial services. Her tears were real, her mourning sincere. She had created a psychological framework that allowed her to believe she was performing acts of love while committing murder. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source, Rebecca herself, during what she thought was a routine performance review with her supervisor. Rebecca broke down and confessed to helping residents pass peacefully. She spoke about her actions as mercy killings, describing in detail how she ensured that residents died before they could deteriorate to the point of losing their dignity and connection to their loved ones. Rebecca's supervisor initially thought she was having an emotional breakdown from the stress of working with dying patients. It wasn't until Rebecca provided specific details about medication dosages and timing that the supervisor realized she was listening to a confession of serial murder. When Detective Santos interviewed Rebecca, she was remarkably forthcoming about her methods and motivations. She showed no signs of traditional criminal behavior, no attempts to deflect blame or minimize her actions. Instead, she spoke about her victims with genuine affection and described her crimes as acts of compassion. "I loved them," Rebecca told Detective Santos during one of their interviews. "Every single one of them. I knew them as people, their stories, their fears, their hopes. I watched them struggle with losing themselves piece by piece, and I couldn't bear to see them suffer through the worst of it. I gave them peace while they were still themselves." The families of Rebecca's victims faced a unique and complex form of trauma. Unlike Patricia Kellerman's victims, who had been murdered by someone motivated by power and control, Rebecca's victims had been killed by someone who genuinely cared about them and believed she was acting in their best interests. This created a profound moral confusion for the families. Many of them had been grateful for Rebecca's attention and care. They had seen how much their loved ones trusted her, how she seemed to understand their needs and provide comfort during difficult times. Learning that this same person had murdered their family members while genuinely believing she was helping them created a psychological complexity that was difficult to process. Linda Morrison, William's daughter, struggled with conflicting emotions during Rebecca's trial. "Part of me knows she's a murderer," Linda testified. "But another part of me remembers how gentle she was with my father, how she made his last months more comfortable. She talked to him like he mattered, like he was still a person worth knowing. I hate her for taking him from us, but I also can't deny that she cared about him in a way that seemed real." The trial became a focal point for debates about end-of-life care, patient autonomy, and the ethics of mercy killing. Rebecca's defense team argued that she was a compassionate healthcare worker who had made tragic decisions while trying to prevent suffering. The prosecution maintained that regardless of her motivations, she had committed premeditated murder and had violated the fundamental trust between healthcare providers and patients. Expert witnesses testified about the complexity of dementia care and the challenges families face when watching loved ones deteriorate. Some argued that Rebecca's actions, while legally wrong, were understandable given the lack of comprehensive end-of-life options for dementia patients. Others emphasized that her decisions represented a fundamental violation of patient rights and medical ethics. The jury ultimately convicted Rebecca on all charges, but their deliberations took longer than in most murder cases, reflecting the moral complexity of her crimes. During sentencing, several family members gave victim impact statements that revealed the ongoing struggle to reconcile their memories of Rebecca's apparent compassion with the reality of her actions. Rebecca was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. After 25 years, the judge acknowledged the unusual nature of her crimes and her apparent genuine belief that she was helping her victims, but emphasized that motivation cannot excuse murder and that patients have the right to live their lives fully, regardless of cognitive impairment. The case led to significant changes in medication management protocols at nursing homes across Ohio, and eventually influenced national standards for monitoring controlled substances in long-term care facilities. New systems for tracking medication administration, mandatory second signature requirements for certain drugs, and enhanced family communication protocols were implemented to prevent similar crimes. But perhaps the most important impact of the Rebecca Torres case was the conversation it started about end-of-life care for dementia patients. Her crimes, while inexcusable, highlighted the genuine fears many families have about watching their loved ones deteriorate and the lack of comprehensive options for managing the final stages of cognitive decline. Rebecca's journal entries, while disturbing evidence of her crimes, also provided insights into the emotional challenges faced by healthcare workers who care for patients with progressive, incurable conditions. The stress of watching people deteriorate, the attachment that develops between caregivers and long-term patients, and the complex emotions around death and suffering all contributed to the psychological state that allowed Rebecca to rationalize murder as mercy. In my final interview with Detective Santos, after Rebecca's sentencing, she reflected on the case's impact on her understanding of healthcare crimes. Patricia Kellerman was a monster who used her position to kill for power, Santos said. Rebecca Torres was someone who genuinely cared, but whose compassion became twisted into something dangerous. In some ways, Rebecca's crimes are more frightening, because they show how good intentions can lead to terrible actions when someone decides they know better than the patient and the family what's best. The Rebecca Torres case taught me that evil in nursing homes doesn't always wear the obvious mask of cruelty or greed. Sometimes it comes disguised as love, as protection, as mercy. It's carried by people who genuinely believe they're helping, who cry real tears for their victims, and who sleep soundly at night, believing they've done good work. This makes such crimes even more insidious, because they exploit not just the vulnerability of the victims, but the trust and gratitude of families, who are desperate for someone to care about their loved ones, when that care becomes contaminated by a caregiver's decision to play God. The result is a betrayal that cuts deeper than simple cruelty, because it corrupts the very concept of compassion itself. As I walked through Sunset Manor's memory care unit months after Rebecca's arrest, I watched the new staff interact with residents and wondered how many other Rebecca Torres were out there, people whose love had been twisted into something dangerous, whose mercy had become a weapon, whose compassion had transformed into the cruelest form of murder. The residents in that unit deserved to live their lives fully, to experience whatever joy and connection remained available to them, regardless of their cognitive limitations. Rebecca had stolen that choice from 23 people, convinced that her assessment of their quality of life was more important than their fundamental right to exist. Her victims had trusted her completely, had seen her as an angel of mercy in their most vulnerable moments. That trust had been the weapon she used to kill them, making her crimes not just murder, but a profound betrayal of everything healthcare is supposed to represent. The smell of lavender air freshener couldn't mask the stench of greed that permeated Golden Years Care Center in Florida, where I spent 3 months uncovering one of the most systematic cases of elder financial abuse and murder I've ever encountered. What made this case particularly haunting was how the crimes were hidden behind a facade of luxury care and genuine affection, a place where residents' final years were stolen not just through death, but through the methodical theft of everything they had worked their entire lives to build. I arrived in Sarasota on a humid August morning, following a trail of suspicious wills and contested estates that had caught the attention of the state attorney's office. The facility looked like a 5-star resort from the outside. Palm trees lined the circular driveway. Fountains bubbled in manicured courtyards, and the lobby featured marble floors and crystal chandeliers that wouldn't have looked out of place in a luxury hotel. Golden Years marketed itself as boutique senior living for discerning retirees, with monthly fees starting at $12,000 and premium suites costing nearly $20,000. The residents were wealthy, often childless or estranged from family, and attracted by the promise of personalized care and an active social community in their final years. The administrator was a woman named Victoria Sterling, a polished executive in her late 40s who had transformed Golden Years from a struggling nursing home into the most expensive senior living facility in the region. Victoria had an MBA from a prestigious university and spoke eloquently about revolutionizing senior care through personalized attention and dignity preservation. But beneath Victoria's professional exterior and the facility's luxurious amenities was a criminal enterprise that had been systematically robbing and murdering elderly residents for over 4 years. The operation was so sophisticated that it had gone undetected until a single oversight exposed the entire conspiracy. It started with Eleanor Blackwood, a 79-year-old widow who had moved to Golden Years after selling her estate in Connecticut. Eleanor had no children and had outlived most of her friends, making her the perfect target for Victoria's scheme. Eleanor's net worth was approximately $2.8 million, accumulated through a combination of her late husband's successful law practice and shrewd investments. Eleanor chose Golden Years specifically because of its promise of personalized care and its location near the community theater where she hoped to volunteer. She was sharp, independent, and determined to make the most of what she assumed would be her final chapter. Within weeks of her arrival, Eleanor was assigned a personal care coordinator named Michael Chen, a charming man in his 30s who seemed genuinely interested in her well-being and her stories about her life in Connecticut. Michael would spend hours with Eleanor, listening to her talk about her late husband, her travels, and her concerns about managing her finances in an unfamiliar state. Michael's attentiveness was part of a carefully orchestrated plan. He was documenting Eleanor's financial assets, her family relationships, and her mental acuity. More importantly, he was building the trust necessary to gain access to her accounts and influence her end-of-life planning decisions. The scheme worked through a network of professionals that Victoria had assembled over several years. Dr. Amanda Walsh was the facility's primary physician, a licensed MD who had lost her hospital privileges years earlier due to overprescribing controlled substances. James Morrison was an attorney who specialized in estate planning and had developed a practice that catered specifically to elderly clients with substantial assets but limited family connections. The operation began with Michael's careful cultivation of Eleanor's trust and dependence. He would help her with small tasks, drive her to appointments, and gradually position himself as her primary support system. Eleanor, grateful for the attention and genuinely fond of Michael, began to rely on him for advice about financial matters and estate planning. After 6 months, Michael suggested that Eleanor might benefit from updating her will and establishing a more efficient system for managing her assets. He recommended James Morrison, describing him as an attorney who specialized in helping seniors protect their wealth from potential estate taxes and healthcare costs. Morrison's initial consultation with Eleanor appeared legitimate and professional. He explained various estate planning strategies and suggested establishing a trust that would provide her with income while protecting the principal from potential long-term care expenses. What Eleanor didn't realize was that the trust documents Morrison prepared gave him and Victoria's organization significant control over her assets. The trust was structured to look legitimate to Eleanor while providing the conspirators with access to her funds through various management and administrative fees. More critically, the trust included provisions that would transfer significant portions of Eleanor's wealth to designated charities that existed only on paper and were controlled by Victoria and her associates. As Eleanor's financial assets were gradually being siphoned through the fraudulent trust, Dr. Walsh began documenting a decline in Eleanor's cognitive function. The medical records showed increasing forgetfulness, episodes of confusion, and concerns about Eleanor's ability to manage her own affairs. These documented concerns would later be used to justify the trust arrangements and to support Eleanor's eventual murder as a natural progression of dementia-related decline. But Eleanor wasn't developing dementia. Dr. Walsh was systematically poisoning her with prescription drugs that caused confusion and memory problems. The medications were administered during Eleanor's regular medical appointments under the guise of treating anxiety and sleep disturbances that Eleanor had never actually experienced. The drugging served multiple purposes in the conspiracy. It created medical documentation of cognitive decline that supported the financial arrangements Morrison had established. It also made Eleanor increasingly dependent on the facility's staff and less likely to question the changes in her financial management. Most importantly, it provided cover for the eventual murder that would prevent Eleanor from discovering the theft and eliminate the possibility of her recovering and exposing the scheme. Eleanor's death occurred 14 months after her arrival at Golden Years. According to Dr. Walsh's records, Eleanor had experienced a rapid decline in cognitive function over the previous 2 months, becoming increasingly confused and agitated. The official cause of death was listed as complications from dementia, with contributing factors including cardiovascular disease and pneumonia. The death appeared natural and expected given the documented decline in Eleanor's condition. Michael played the role of grieving caregiver perfectly, organizing a memorial service and helping to execute Eleanor's estate. According to the trust documents Morrison had prepared, by the time Eleanor was buried, over $1.8 million of her wealth had been transferred to the fake charities, controlled by Victoria's organization. The conspiracy had been operating for years before Eleanor's case, victimizing dozens of wealthy residents who fit the profile of isolated seniors with substantial assets. The victims were carefully selected based on their financial worth, their family situations, and their vulnerability to manipulation. The selection process was sophisticated and thorough. Victoria maintained detailed files on all prospective residents, including background checks that went far beyond standard admission requirements. She investigated family relationships, looked for signs of estrangement or conflict, and specifically targeted individuals whose deaths would be unlikely to trigger intensive scrutiny from relatives or law enforcement. Once a target was selected and admitted to golden years, the process would unfold over months or sometimes years. The timeline depended on the complexity of the victim's financial situation and their level of social connection outside the facility. Residents with more complex estates or closer family ties required longer cultivation periods and more careful documentation of their supposed decline. The medical component of the conspiracy was crucial to its success. Dr. Walsh had developed expertise in using prescription medications to create symptoms that mimicked various forms of dementia and age decline. She would gradually introduce drugs that caused confusion, memory problems, and physical weakness, carefully calibrating the dosages to create a believable progression of illness. The medications were administered through legitimate prescriptions for conditions like anxiety, depression, and sleep disorders, conditions that were common among elderly residents adjusting to nursing home life. This provided cover for the drugging and created a paper trail that supported the narrative of declining health and cognitive function. As residents became increasingly impaired by the medications, their ability to monitor their own financial affairs or question the arrangements Morrison had established diminished significantly. Many became completely dependent on the facility's staff for information about the outside world and accepted explanations about their finances without the capacity to verify or challenge them. The murder methods varied depending on the victims, documented medical conditions, and the desired timeline. Some residents were killed through overdoses of their prescribed medications, administered gradually over several weeks to mimic natural decline. Others were given injections of insulin or other substances that would cause organ failure, consistent with their supposed underlying health problems. Dr. Walsh's medical expertise allowed her to choose methods that would be virtually undetectable in standard autopsies and consistent with the medical histories she had created for the victims. The deaths appeared to be natural consequences of the documented illnesses, and the families, when they existed, were typically prepared for the loss. Based on the reports of decline they had received, the financial component of the conspiracy was equally sophisticated. Morrison had established a network of shell companies and fake charitable organizations that existed only on paper, but appeared legitimate to cursory investigation. The estate planning documents he prepared for victims were complex enough to seem professional, while containing provisions that allowed for the systematic theft of assets. The thefts occurred through a combination of management fees, charitable donations, and direct transfers that were buried in complex trust documents. The amounts were calculated to avoid triggering automated reporting requirements or drawing attention from financial institutions that might question unusual transaction patterns. Victoria's role was to coordinate the entire operation and maintain the facade of legitimate senior care that allowed the scheme to continue. She recruited and managed the staff members who were part of the conspiracy while ensuring that other employees and residents remained unaware of the criminal activities. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source, a clerical error that exposed the entire operation. Eleanor Blackwood's estate attorney in Connecticut had been monitoring the execution of her estate and noticed discrepancies in the charitable donations that had been made according to her trust documents. The attorney discovered that one of the charities that had received a substantial donation from Eleanor's estate, the American Senior Dignity Foundation, had never actually applied for tax-exempt status with the IRS, despite claims that it was a registered charity. Further investigation revealed that the foundation existed only as a post office box and a basic website, with no actual operations or legitimate charitable activities. This discovery triggered an investigation into Morrison's other recent estate cases, which revealed a pattern of donations to non-existent charities and suspicious financial arrangements. When investigators began examining the medical records of residents who had died at golden years, They found documentation of rapid cognitive decline that didn't match the experiences of family members who had maintained contact with the victims. The investigation expanded to include forensic accounting analysis of golden years, financial records, and the personal finances of Victoria and her conspirators. The analysis revealed millions of dollars in stolen assets and a pattern of victim selection that clearly demonstrated the premeditated nature of the crimes. When confronted with the evidence, Dr. Walsh became the first conspirator to cooperate with prosecutors. She provided detailed information about the medical aspects of the scheme and helped investigators understand how the murders had been disguised as natural deaths. Her testimony revealed the clinical calculation with which the conspirators had selected victims and executed their crimes. The trial of Victoria Sterling and her co-conspirators lasted 8 months and included testimony from dozens of witnesses, including former residents who had witnessed suspicious activities at Golden Years and family members who described the gradual isolation and decline of their loved ones. The prosecution presented evidence of 43 murders committed over 4 years, with total theft amounts exceeding $12 million. The victims ranged in age from 74 to 91, and all had been wealthy individuals with limited family connections who had trusted the facility and its staff with their care and their financial security. Victoria was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dr. Walsh received a sentence of 35 years in exchange for her cooperation with the investigation. Morrison was sentenced to 45 years, and Michael Chen received 25 years for his role in the conspiracy. The Golden Years case revealed the particular vulnerability of wealthy elderly individuals who lack close family connections, and the sophisticated methods criminals can use to exploit the trust placed in healthcare and legal professionals. The case led to enhanced oversight of senior living facilities and new requirements for monitoring the financial activities of residents who may be vulnerable to exploitation. But perhaps most importantly, the case highlighted the need for family members and friends to maintain active involvement in the lives of elderly relatives, even when they appear to be receiving excellent care in high-quality facilities. The isolation that allowed Victoria's conspiracy to succeed could have been prevented by more frequent contact and greater attention to changes in the victims' behavior and circumstances. The residents who died at Golden Years had worked their entire lives to accumulate the wealth that was stolen from them. They had trusted the facility and its staff to provide them with dignity and security in their final years. Instead, they had been systematically robbed and murdered by people who saw their vulnerability as an opportunity for profit. The luxury amenities and professional facades that attracted residents to Golden Years had been paid for with money stolen from previous victims. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers were monuments to greed, financed by the life savings of elderly people who had been betrayed by those they trusted most. As I walked through the empty corridors of Golden Years after its closure, I could almost hear the voices of the victims, Eleanor, Blackwood, and the 42 others who had died, believing they were surrounded by people who cared about their well-being. Their trust had been the weapon used against them, and their isolation had been the shield that protected their killers. The case taught me that evil in nursing homes can be motivated by something as simple and ancient as greed, but executed with a sophistication that makes it nearly undetectable. When financial predators target the elderly, they don't just steal money, they steal peace of mind, dignity, and ultimately life itself. The victims of Golden Years deserved to live their final years surrounded by genuine care and respect. Instead, they had been preyed upon by criminals who viewed their wealth as assets to be harvested and their lives as obstacles to be eliminated. Their deaths were not just murders, but the final acts in a systematic campaign of exploitation that had stolen everything they had worked their entire lives to achieve. The silence and neglect cases is deafening, not the peaceful quiet of rest, but the hollow absence of care compassion, and basic human dignity. I learned this during my investigation into Riverside Manor in Michigan, where what appeared to be a struggling nursing home with staffing problems was actually a house of horrors, where residents were dying slow, agonizing deaths through systematic neglect and deliberate indifference. Unlike the previous cases I'd investigated, where murder was active and intentional, the crimes at Riverside Manor were sins of omission, a deliberate failure to provide care that killed just as surely as poison or violence, but left fewer obvious traces and created a different kind of hell for its victims. I was contacted by Adult Protective Services investigator Janet Williams in late October, when the first frost was settling over the Michigan landscape. Janet had worked elder abuse cases for 12 years, but something about the reports she was receiving from Riverside Manor was keeping her awake at night. "It's not what they're doing," Janet told me during our first phone conversation. "It's what they're not doing. The residents are dying from bed sores, malnutrition, dehydration, infections, all things that should never happen with proper care. But when I try to investigate, everything looks just barely legal on paper. The staffing ratios meet minimum requirements, the medication logs look complete, the facility passes basic inspections. It's like they've figured out exactly how little care they can provide without technically breaking the law." Riverside Manor was located in a decaying industrial neighborhood, surrounded by abandoned factories and vacant lots. The building itself was a converted warehouse from the 1960s, renovated on a shoestring budget to meet basic nursing home requirements. The exterior was gray concrete, with small windows that gave it the appearance of a prison more than a healthcare facility. The residents who ended up at Riverside Manor were primarily those without family advocates or financial resources, patients who had been placed there by social services or discharged from hospitals with no other options. Many suffered from dementia or other conditions that limited their ability to communicate their needs or complain about their treatment. The facility was owned by North Star Healthcare, a corporation that operated 17 nursing homes across 3 states. North Star's business model was based on maximizing profit by operating at the absolute minimum standards required by law, while cutting every possible corner in actual care delivery, thought the administrator at Riverside Manor was Carl Brennan, a man in his early 50s who had worked in nursing home management for over 20 years. Carl understood exactly how to manipulate the regulatory system, how to maintain documentation that would satisfy inspectors while creating conditions that were barely survivable for residents. The systematic neglect at Riverside Manor was carefully orchestrated to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements or regulatory penalties. Residents were provided with just enough care to keep them technically alive while maximizing the facility's profit margins through minimal staffing and substandard conditions. My investigation began with the case of Dorothy Williams, an 80 woman with moderate dementia who had been placed at Riverside Manor after falling and breaking her hip at home. Dorothy had no children and had outlived most of her friends, making her dependent on social services for her care placement. Dorothy's case was brought to Janet's attention by a volunteer from a local church group who visited nursing homes to provide companionship to residents without regular visitors. The volunteer, Mary Patterson, had been visiting Dorothy weekly for several months and had become increasingly concerned about her deteriorating condition. "When I first started visiting Dorothy, she was thin but alert," Mary told me during our interview. "She could carry on conversations. She recognized me when I came to visit, and she seemed to enjoy the books I would read to her. But over the course of 6 months, I watched her waste away. Her skin became gray and papery, she developed terrible sores, and she seemed to be in constant pain. When I asked the staff about her condition, they would just say she was declining naturally because of her dementia. But Dorothy's decline wasn't natural. She was dying from systematic starvation, dehydration, and medical neglect that was carefully disguised as age-related deterioration. The facility's records showed that Dorothy was receiving appropriate nutrition and medical care, But the reality was far different. The food service at Riverside Manor was outsourced to the cheapest possible vendor, providing meals that barely met minimum caloric requirements and were often spoiled or contaminated. Residents who couldn't feed themselves, like Dorothy, who had developed swallowing difficulties, were often left with untouched meal trays rather than receiving the assistance they needed to eat. Dorothy's medical chart showed regular documentation of her food intake, but the staff was falsifying these records. They would mark that Dorothy had consumed full meals, when in reality she was eating very little and was slowly starving. Her weight loss was documented but attributed to the natural progression of dementia rather than malnutrition. The dehydration was even more systematic. Dorothy required assistance with drinking due to her swallowing difficulties and confusion about when to drink fluids. The understaffed facility simply didn't have enough personnel to provide this assistance regularly. So Dorothy would go hours, or sometimes entire days, with inadequate fluid intake. The medical neglect was perhaps the most cruel aspect of Dorothy's treatment. She had developed a urinary tract infection that went untreated for weeks, causing excruciating pain and eventually spreading to her kidneys. The infection was noted in her chart, but the antibiotic treatment prescribed by her physician was never consistently administered by the nursing staff. Dorothy also developed pressure sores from being left in the same position for extended periods without being turned. The sores started as small red areas, but progressed to deep, infected wounds that exposed bone. The facility's documentation showed that Dorothy was being repositioned every 2 hours as required, but the progression of her bed sores proved this was false. The most horrifying aspect of Dorothy's case was that her suffering was visible to staff members every day, yet nothing was done to relieve it. She would cry out in pain when moved, beg for water when volunteers visited, and showed clear signs of distress that were ignored by the people responsible for her care. Dorothy died on a January morning after 7 months at Riverside Manor. The death certificate listed complications from dementia as the primary cause, with contributing factors including malnutrition and sepsis from infected pressure wounds. To outside observers, it appeared that an elderly woman with dementia had died from natural complications of her condition. But Dorothy's death was actually the result of months of systematic torture through neglect. She had been starved, dehydrated, left to lie in infected wounds, and denied basic pain relief, while the facility collected thousands of dollars per month for Medicaid for her care. Dorothy's case was not unique at Riverside Manor. The investigation revealed that the facility's entire operation was based on providing the absolute minimum care necessary to avoid regulatory sanctions, while maximizing profit through reduced staffing and substandard conditions. The staffing strategy was particularly cynical. Riverside Manor employed just enough nurses and aides to meet minimum regulatory ratios during inspection periods, but operated with significantly reduced staff during nights, weekends, and holidays when inspectors were unlikely to visit. This meant that residents went extended periods with essentially no professional care. The certified nursing assistants who worked at Riverside Manor were overloaded with impossible castle loads, phone responsible for 30 or more residents during overnight shifts. Even with the best intentions, it was impossible for them to provide adequate care to that many vulnerable people. Many of the aides were new to healthcare and lacked the training necessary to recognize serious medical conditions or provide proper care. The nursing staff was similarly overwhelmed, and the facility employed licensed practical nurses, rather than registered nurses whenever possible to reduce labor costs. And many of these nurses lacked experience in geriatric care or the management of complex medical conditions common among nursing home residents. The systematic nature of the neglect at Riverside Manor became clear as I investigated additional cases. Robert Martinez, a 76-year-old man with diabetes and early-stage dementia, died from complications related to uncontrolled blood sugar. His medical chart showed regular blood glucose monitoring and insulin administration, but the actual care he received was sporadic and inadequate. Robert's diabetes management required careful monitoring of his diet, regular blood sugar testing, and timely insulin injections adjusted based on his glucose levels. At Riverside Manor, his blood sugar was often not tested for days at a time, his insulin injections were frequently missed or delayed, and his dietary restrictions were ignored by food service staff who provided him with high-sugar foods that destabilized his condition. Robert's family lived out of state and visited infrequently, relying on phone calls with facility staff for updates on his condition. The staff consistently reported that Robert was doing well and that his diabetes was well controlled, even as he was developing serious complications from unmanaged blood sugar levels. Robert experienced several episodes of diabetic ketoacidosis that required emergency hospitalization, but each time he was stabilized at the hospital and returned to Riverside Manor, where the same pattern of inadequate care would resume. The facility's records showed that lessons had been learned from each hospitalization and that care plans had been updated, but no actual changes were made to Robert's treatment. Robert's final hospitalization occurred when he was found unresponsive in his room during a morning check. He had been in diabetic coma for an unknown period of time, and the lack of oxygen to his brain caused irreversible damage. He died in the hospital 3 days later without regaining consciousness. The hospital staff who treated Robert were shocked by his condition and the evidence of long-term neglect they observed. His body showed signs of severe malnutrition, dehydration, and multiple infected wounds that had gone untreated. The attending physician told investigators that Robert's condition was consistent with months of systematic medical neglect. Similar patterns emerged in case after case at Riverside Manor. Residents with treatable conditions were allowed to deteriorate and die because the facility lacked the staff, training, or commitment necessary to provide proper care. The deaths were technically natural, caused by complications from underlying medical conditions, but they were preventable deaths that resulted from deliberate indifference to human suffering. The investigation revealed that Carl Brennan and North Healthcare were fully aware of the conditions at Riverside Manor and had made conscious decisions to prioritize profit over resident care. Internal company documents showed discussions about maximizing Medicaid reimbursement rates while minimizing care expenses, with specific strategies for avoiding regulatory penalties while providing substandard care. One particularly damning document was an email from Carl Brennan to North Star's corporate office, discussing staffing reductions. We can operate with minimum ratios during inspection periods and reduce staff significantly during off. The residents who are most likely to complain or have family advocates aren't typically placed at our facilities, so the risk of exposure is minimal. This approach could increase profit margins by 15 to 20% annually. The corporate culture at North Healthcare treated residents as revenue sources rather than human beings deserving of care and dignity. Training materials for administrators included strategies for maximizing billing while minimizing actual service delivery, and performance evaluations for facility managers were based primarily on profit margins rather than care quality or resident outcomes. The breakthrough in the investigation came when a certified nursing assistant named Maria Santos contacted Janet Williams with detailed information about conditions at Riverside Manor. Maria had worked at the facility for 8 months and had become increasingly disturbed by what she witnessed. Maria provided photographs she had taken of residents' conditions, documentation of medication errors and mistreatments, and recordings of conversations with supervisors who had instructed her to falsify care records. Her evidence provided the foundation necessary for a comprehensive investigation into the facility's operations. I became a nursing assistant because I wanted to help people, Maria told me during our interview. What I saw at Riverside Manor wasn't healthcare, it was slow-motion murder. These people were dying horrible deaths while everyone pretended they were receiving proper care. I couldn't stay silent and let it continue. Maria's courage in speaking out came at significant personal cost. She lost her job and faced difficulty finding employment at other healthcare facilities due to her whistleblower status. But her testimony was crucial in exposing the systematic neglect that had killed dozens of residents at Riverside Manor. The investigation ultimately revealed that 67 residents had died at Riverside Manor over a 3-year period due to preventable complications from neglect. The victims had suffered from treatable conditions like infections, malnutrition, dehydration, and medication management errors that proved fatal due to the facility's deliberate indifference to their needs. Carl Brennan was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and criminal neglect charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Northstar Healthcare was fined millions of dollars and forced to divest its nursing home operations. The corporation's executives faced civil lawsuits from families of victims, but avoided criminal charges due to the difficulty of proving direct responsibility for the neglect policies. The case led to significant reforms in nursing home oversight and inspection procedures, new requirements for unannounced inspections, enhanced penalties for systematic neglect, and improved whistleblower protections for healthcare workers were implemented across Michigan and eventually adopted by other states. But perhaps the most important impact of the Riverside Manor case was the awareness it raised about the vulnerability of elderly residents in substandard facilities and the need for family members and advocates to maintain active involvement in monitoring the care their loved ones receive. The residents who died at Riverside Manor had been abandoned by society, placed in a facility that prioritized profit over human dignity, and left to suffer without advocates to speak for their needs. Their deaths were not quick or merciful, but slow deteriorations marked by pain, fear, and the gradual realization that no one was coming to help them. Dorothy Williams, Robert Martinez, and the 65 other victims of Riverside Manor's systematic neglect deserved to live their final years with dignity and proper medical care. Instead, they were treated as disposable sources of revenue, allowed to suffer and die while their caregivers collected payment for services that were never actually provided. Their deaths serve as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence or dramatic crimes. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as cost-cutting measures and efficiency improvements, carried out by people who convince themselves that substandard care is acceptable for people who can't fight back. The silence that filled the halls of Riverside Manor wasn't peace, it was the absence of hope, the sound of people dying alone while the world looked away. It was the silence of a society that had failed its most vulnerable members, and the echo of voices that would never be heard again. The most devastating betrayals come from those we trust most completely, and nowhere is this truth more horrifying than when family members become the architects of their elderly relatives' destruction. This final journey into darkness brought me to Willowbrook Assisted Living in Oregon, where I uncovered a conspiracy that shattered my understanding of family loyalty and revealed how those closest to us can become our most dangerous predators. It was a rainy November evening when I received a call from Detective Sarah Mitchell of the Portland Police Department. The exhaustion in her voice was palpable as she described a case that had been haunting her for months. A pattern of suspicious deaths at an upscale assisted living facility where the victim's own children seemed strangely eager to see them. Gone. We have 7 deaths in 18 months, Detective Mitchell told me, the sound of rain against her office window audible through the phone. All natural causes, according to the medical examiner. All residents with substantial assets, and all with children who stood to inherit significant amounts of money. But here's what's bothering me. Single. One of these children had recently increased their parents' life insurance policies, or had been asking about their inheritance. Timeline just weeks before the deaths occurred. Willowbrook Assisted Living was the kind of facility that wealthy families chose when they wanted the best possible care for their aging parents, but couldn't provide it themselves. Located in an affluent suburb of Portland, The facility offered luxury apartments, gourmet dining, and comprehensive medical care in a setting that resembled an exclusive resort more than a nursing home. The residents at Willowbrook were primarily affluent retirees who had moved there voluntarily, attracted by the facility's reputation for excellence and its promise to provide dignity and independence in a safe, supportive environment. Most maintained close relationships with their adult children and had family members who visited regularly and stayed involved in their care decisions. This family involvement, which should have been a protective factor for the residents, had been weaponized by a group of adult children who saw their parents' longevity as an obstacle to their own financial security. What made this case particularly insidious was how the conspirators used their legitimate access and authority as family members to facilitate murders that appeared completely natural. The investigation began with the death of Harrison Webb, an 81-year-old retired investment banker who had moved to Willowbrook 2 years earlier after his wife's death. Harrison was in excellent health for his age, mentally sharp, and actively involved in managing a portfolio worth approximately $4.2 million. Harrison's son, Bradley Webb, was a 52-year-old real estate developer who had been struggling financially due to several failed projects and mounting debts. Bradley visited his father regularly at Willowbrook and 2 outside observers. He appeared to be a devoted son who was concerned about his father's well-being and comfort, but Bradley was actually monitoring his father's health and financial decisions, looking for opportunities to accelerate his inheritance. Harrison had recently mentioned that he was considering donating a substantial portion of his wealth to charity, a decision that would significantly reduce Bradley's expected inheritance. Bradley's solution was to arrange his father's death in a way that would appear natural, while ensuring that the charitable donations never occurred. He accomplished this through a conspiracy with Dr. Marcus Chen, Willowbrook's primary physician, and Patricia Sullivan, the facility's head of nursing. Dr. Chen was facing financial pressure from a gambling addiction and mounting personal debts. Patricia Sullivan was being blackmailed by Bradley over an affair she was having with a married colleague. Both were vulnerable to Bradley's manipulation and eventually agreed to participate in a murder conspiracy that would benefit all 3 of them financially. The murder method was sophisticated and nearly undetectable. Harrison suffered from mild hypertension and took prescription medication to manage his blood pressure. Dr. Chen began prescribing additional medications for anxiety and sleep, disturbances that Harrison hadn't actually been experiencing, building a medical record that would support the eventual cause of death. Over the course of several weeks, Patricia Sullivan administered increasingly dangerous combinations of Harrison's legitimate medications, along with additional drugs that would interact to cause cardiac arrest. The dosages were carefully calculated to cause a fatal heart attack that would appear to be a natural consequence of Harrison's age and documented medical conditions. Harrison's death occurred on a Sunday morning when Bradley was visiting. According to the incident report, Harrison complained of chest pain during breakfast and collapsed shortly afterward. Despite immediate medical attention from Dr. Chen and the facility's nursing staff, Harrison could not be revived. The death appeared to be a tragic but not unexpected cardiac event in an elderly man with documented heart and anxiety issues. Bradley played the role of grieving son perfectly, making funeral arrangements and working with attorneys to execute his father's estate according to the existing will, which left the majority of Harrison's wealth to Bradley rather than to the charities Harrison had been considering. What Bradley, Dr. Chen, and Patricia Sullivan didn't know was that Harrison had confided his concerns about Bradley's financial problems to his longtime friend and attorney, Robert Martinez. Harrison had been worried that Bradley's mounting debts might lead him to make poor decisions, and he had asked Martinez to monitor the situation and be alert to any signs of undue influence. Martinez became suspicious when Bradley immediately began asking about accessing his inheritance and showed no interest in investigating the circumstances of his father's sudden death. When Martinez learned that Bradley had increased his father's life insurance policy just 6 weeks before the death, his suspicions crystallized into alarm. Martinez contacted Detective Mitchell, initiating the investigation that would eventually uncover the entire conspiracy. But Harrison's murder was just the beginning of a systematic campaign of family-orchestrated elder murders that had been operating at Willowbrook for over a year. The second victim was Margaret Foster, a 79-year-old widow whose daughter, Lisa Foster Montgomery, was facing bankruptcy due to a failed restaurant venture. Margaret had been supporting Lisa financially for years, but she had recently decided to limit her assistance and had begun questioning Lisa's spending habits and business decisions. Lisa's response was to arrange her mother's murder through the same conspiracy that had killed Harrison Webb. She contacted Bradley Webb through mutual business connections, and he introduced her to Dr. Chen and Patricia Sullivan. The price for arranging a parent's death was $100,000, paid from the victim's estate after the murder was completed. Margaret's murder followed a similar pattern to Harrison's, but with modifications based on her medical history and medications. Margaret suffered from arthritis and took pain medication regularly. Dr. Chen began prescribing stronger opioids for Margaret, ostensibly to manage increasing pain levels, while documenting concerns about her growing dependence on the medications. Patricia Sullivan then administered fatal overdoses of the prescribed pain medications, timing Margaret's death to occur during a period when Lisa was out of town on a supposed business trip. The death appeared to be an accidental overdose by an elderly woman who had become confused about her medication schedule, a tragically common occurrence among seniors managing multiple prescriptions. Lisa's grief appeared genuine to those who knew her, and her alibi was solid. She inherited Margaret's estate of $1.8 million and used the funds to pay off her business debts and start a new venture. The payment to the murder conspiracy was disguised as medical expenses and legal fees related to her mother's estate. The conspiracy expanded as word spread among adult children who were struggling financially and had wealthy parents at Willowbrook. The murders became a macabre business, with Bradley Webb serving as the coordinator who connected desperate adult children with the corrupt medical professionals who would carry out the killings. Dr. Chen and Patricia Sullivan refined their methods with each murder, learning to choose killing methods that matched each victim's medical history and would be most likely to avoid suspicion. They developed expertise in drug interactions, dosage calculations, and documentation techniques that created convincing medical narratives for the deaths. The psychological profile of the adult children who participated in the conspiracy revealed individuals who had become so focused on their financial problems that they lost sight of their moral obligations to their parents. Many had been financially dependent on their parents for years and viewed their inheritance as money that was rightfully theirs, just temporarily held by their parents. The conspiracy included safety measures to avoid detection, such as spacing the murders over time, varying the methods and apparent causes of death, and ensuring that the participating adult children had solid alibis during the actual killings. The conspirators also avoided targeting residents with multiple children or complex family situations that might lead to disputes over inheritance or closer scrutiny of the deaths. By the time Detective Mitchell began her investigation, the conspiracy had murdered 9 residents of Willowbrook Assisted Living, generating over $8 million in inheritance payments for the participating adult children and over $900,000 in fees for Dr. Chen and Patricia Sullivan. The breakthrough in the case came when Detective Mitchell noticed that several of the suspicious deaths had been attended by the same physician and nurse, and that all of the deceased residents' children had recently made significant financial investments or debt payments. Shortly after their parents' deaths, the investigation involved complex financial analysis, medical record reviews, and surveillance of the suspected conspirators. Detective Mitchell worked with forensic accountants to trace the flow of inheritance money and identify patterns in the financial activities of the adult children involved in the conspiracy. The evidence that finally exposed the conspiracy came from Patricia Sullivan's personal records. She had been keeping detailed notes about each murder, including information about the victims' family situations, the methods used to kill them, and the payments received from their children. Patricia's notes revealed the cold calculation behind each murder and the way the conspirators had evaluated the victims based on their wealth, their family relationships, and their vulnerability to the killing methods Dr. Chen could employ. One entry, describing the planning for Harrison Webb's murder, read, "Subject has single adult child with financial motivation. Medical history supports cardiac event. Timing optimal due to recent insurance increase and charitable donation concerns." When confronted with the evidence, Dr. Chen became the first conspirator to cooperate with prosecutors. His testimony revealed the full scope of the operation and provided detailed information about the murder methods used for each victim. He described how the conspirators had researched drug interactions and dosage calculations to ensure that the murders would appear to be natural deaths. The trial of the Willowbrook conspiracy lasted over a year and included testimony from dozens of witnesses, including surviving residents, family members of the victims, and medical experts who explained how the murders had been disguised as natural deaths. If you made it this far into the darkness with us tonight, leave a comment with the word shadow so we know you're one of the brave ones. Your courage to face these truths helps protect the vulnerable among us and ensures that these crimes cannot hide in silence. The prosecution presented evidence that the conspiracy had murdered 9 residents and attempted to murder 3 others who survived due to unexpected medical interventions or dosage miscalculations. The financial motivation was clear in every case, with the adult children receiving substantial inheritance payments that they used to resolve their financial problems. Bradley Webb was convicted as the leader of the conspiracy and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dr. Chen received a sentence of 35 years in exchange for his cooperation. Patricia Sullivan was sentenced to 40 years. The 7 adult children who had paid for their parents' murders received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. The case revealed the particular vulnerability of elderly individuals, whose own family members view them as financial obstacles rather than beloved relatives deserving of protection and care. The victims had trusted their children completely and had no reason to suspect that their own family members were planning their deaths. The impact on the surviving residents of Willowbrook was profound. Many became fearful of their own family members and questioned whether they could trust anyone with their care. The facility implemented new oversight procedures and monitoring systems, but the psychological damage to the community could not be easily repaired. The case also highlighted the importance of independent oversight and advocacy for elderly individuals, even those with apparently loving and attentive families. The assumption that family members will always act in their elderly relatives' best interests proved tragically false in this case, where financial desperation overcame family loyalty. The victims of the Willowbrook conspiracy had worked their entire lives to build the wealth that their children ultimately murdered them to inherit. They had loved and supported their children through difficult times, never imagining that their generosity would eventually cost them their lives. Harrison Webb had been proud of his son's entrepreneurial spirit and had helped fund Bradley's early business ventures. Margaret Foster had sacrificed her own financial security to support Lisa's dreams of restaurant ownership. The other victims had similarly demonstrated love and support for their children, only to have that love repaid with betrayal and murder. The conspiracy represented a fundamental corruption of the family bond and a betrayal of the trust that should exist between generations. The adult children involved had not only committed murder, they had destroyed the very relationships that should have provided comfort and security to their parents in their final years. As I concluded my investigation into the Willowbrook conspiracy, I was struck by how the facility had returned to apparent normalcy. New residents had moved into the apartments where the victims had lived. New families visited on weekends, and life continued, as if the horrors of the previous years had never occurred. But the ghosts of Harrison Webb, Margaret Foster, and the 7 other victims lingered in those halls. Their deaths served as a reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that our most trusted relationships can become weapons in the hands of those who prioritize money over love. The assisted living industry faced increased scrutiny following the Willowbrook case, with new requirements for background checks on family members with financial authority over residents, and enhanced monitoring of medication administration and death reporting. But no system can fully protect against the betrayal of trust that occurred in this case. The children who murdered their parents at Willowbrook had crossed a line that most people cannot even imagine approaching. They had looked into the eyes of the people who had given them life, who had loved and supported them through their own struggles. And they had decided that money was more important than that bond. Their crimes were not just murders. They were the ultimate violation of the sacred trust between parent and child, and a corruption of love itself. The victims died believing they were surrounded by family members who cared about their well-being, never knowing that those same family members were counting the days until they could collect their inheritance. In the end, the most chilling aspect of the Willowbrook case was not the sophisticated murder methods or the systematic nature of the conspiracy. It was the realization that sometimes the people who pose the greatest danger to our elderly loved ones are not strangers in the night or corrupt healthcare workers, but the very family members we assume will protect them. The darkness I've guided you through tonight reveals truths about human nature that we would prefer not to acknowledge. But by bearing witness to these crimes, by refusing to look away from the suffering of the vulnerable, we honor the memory of those who were lost and create a vigilance that might protect others from similar fates. The residents of nursing homes and assisted living facilities across our country deserve to live their final years with dignity, respect, and genuine care. They deserve to trust that their families will protect them, that their caregivers will honor their sacred duty, and that society will not abandon them in their most vulnerable moments. Tonight's journey through these dark corridors of betrayal and murder serves as both a warning and a call to action. The evil that lurks behind gentle smiles and caring facades can only be defeated by those who refuse to remain silent, who choose to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, and who remember that our humanity is measured by how we treat our most vulnerable members. Good night, and sweet dreams.